The sharp sound of heels clicking against the tiled floor echoed through the office. The woman kept her head down, gripping the stack of papers in her hands as she rushed to deliver them. Her hands trembled, her vision slightly blurred from the lack of sleep, but she pushed forward. She couldn't afford to slow down, not today. A voice sliced through the air, laced with irritation. "Are you seriously late again?" The woman flinched, her heart pounding. The manager stood there, arms crossed, looking down at her with disgust. Several colleagues nearby paused their conversations, smirking, whispering. "She's always struggling," one of them murmured. "Maybe if she dressed properly, she'd be taken seriously," another chuckled. Heat rushed to her face, but she stayed silent. She knew that nothing she said would matter. They wouldn't believe her anyway. The manager sighed dramatically. "This is unacceptable. Everyone else manages just fine. Why is it so hard for you?" Her lips parted, a weak excuse forming on her tongue, but she swallowed it down. What could she say? That she had been up all night taking care of someone who depended on her? That she barely had enough to eat? They wouldn't care. The manager shook his head. "Last warning." He snatched the documents from her hands and walked away. Laughter followed as she turned toward her desk, hands clenched into fists. Her worn-out blouse, her scuffed shoes, everything about her screamed struggle. But they only saw what they wanted to see, a woman who wasn't good enough. She slowly sank into her chair, exhaling shakily. They had no idea. No idea that her world was falling apart. No idea that she was carrying a burden too heavy to bear. No idea that tonight, she'd have to make a choice, one that would change everything. The office buzzed with life, but she felt like a ghost, unseen and unheard. She typed away at her desk, her fingers cold and stiff from exhaustion. The numbers on the screen blurred together, her mind clouded with the same worries that haunted her every day. Her shift would end soon. Then reality would hit harder than ever. She checked her phone under the desk. A single unread message from the home nurse. "Your mother's condition is getting worse. She needs the stronger medicine now." Her stomach twisted. She didn't have enough money for it. The weight of her life pressed down on her chest. Bills piled up on the kitchen table, reminders of her helplessness. Electricity. Rent. Medicine. Food. There was never enough. And yet, every morning, she dragged herself to this place, where people mocked her, underestimated her, judged her for things they didn't understand. A sharp voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "You haven't finished that report?" The manager's glare cut through her. "Unbelievable. Maybe this job isn't for you." Laughter rippled through the room. She felt the sting of humiliation. She lowered her head. They didn't know. They didn't know she barely slept. They didn't know she spent her nights beside a hospital bed. They didn't know how hard she fought just to make it here every morning. She gritted her teeth, swallowing the lump in her throat. Crying wouldn't help. No one would help. Her fingers tightened around her pen. If only they knew the truth. But they never would. Because tonight, she'd have to make a choice that no one should ever have to make. The streets were dark by the time she stepped out of the office, the cold air biting at her skin. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her body, but it did nothing to keep the chill away. Her feet ached, her body screamed for rest, but she had no time for that. Her mother needed the medicine. Tonight. Her trembling fingers dug into her purse, pulling out the last few bills she had. She counted them twice, then a third time, as if the numbers would magically change. Not enough. Her stomach churned. She had been cutting back on food, skipping meals, wearing the same clothes until the fabric wore thin, but no matter how much she sacrificed, it was never enough. Her mind raced for a solution. She could beg her manager for an advance. No, he would laugh in her face. She could borrow from a colleague. No one would even look at her, let alone help. There was only one option left. The one she had been avoiding. Her heart pounded as she walked toward the small pawn shop on the corner. The neon sign flickered, casting a dull glow over the street. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The man behind the counter barely looked up. Selling or pawning? She hesitated, then reached into her purse, fingers brushing against something precious. A delicate bracelet. Her mother's. It was old, but the silver still gleamed under the shop lights. A small charm dangled from the chain, her mother's initials, engraved years ago when life was different. When things were better. Her chest tightened as she set it on the counter. How much for this? The man picked it up, inspecting it with bored eyes. Not much. Maybe enough for a few meals. Her hands clenched into fists. Meals wouldn't save her mother's life. She swallowed hard. Please, I need more. It's worth more. The man sighed, setting the bracelet down. That's the best I can do. A lump formed in her throat. She didn't have a choice. With shaking fingers, she nodded. I'll take it. As the man handed her the money, her vision blurred. She clutched the bills tightly, feeling like she had just given away the last piece of hope she had left. And yet, as she stepped out into the cold, a single thought kept repeating in her mind. She needs this more than I do. She turned toward the pharmacy, clutching the money like a lifeline. She had nothing left for herself. But she had to save her mother. And no one at work would ever know the price she had paid. She clutched the small paper bag tightly as she hurried through the empty streets, her breath visible in the cold night air. The pharmacy had taken almost every penny she had, but the medicine was finally in her hands. It had to be enough. As she neared her building, a wave of exhaustion hit her like a freight train. Her body screamed for rest, but there was no time. Inside, the dimly lit apartment was silent, except for the faint, uneven breathing coming from the small bed in the corner. Her mother. She was curled beneath a thin blanket, her face pale and drawn, her body so fragile it looked like it could disappear at any moment. The sight made her chest tighten. She rushed to her side, setting the medicine down. Gently, she touched her mother's forehead, too warm. The fever hadn't broken. "Ma," she whispered, her voice soft, almost breaking. The older woman's eyes flickered open, and a weak smile crossed her lips. "You're home late." Tears pricked at her eyes. I got your medicine." Her mother's hand found hers, squeezing it lightly. "You always do too much. You need to rest." Rest. How could she? She barely had enough money to keep them in this tiny apartment. The bills were overdue. Her job was hanging by a thread. And she was running on empty. But she forced a smile. "I'm fine." Her mother studied her, as if she could see through the lie. "Did you eat today?" She hesitated for only a second, but it was enough. Her mother sighed, trying to sit up, but her body was too weak. "You need to take care of yourself too." A lump formed in her throat. That wasn't an option. She helped her mother take the medicine, then tucked her in carefully, brushing strands of hair from her face. Her mother's eyes fluttered closed, her breathing softening. Relief flooded her. At least for tonight, her mother would be okay. She slumped down on the floor beside the bed, her back against the wall. Her body begged for sleep, but her mind raced. Tomorrow, she had to face work again. She had to pretend. Pretend she wasn't starving. Pretend she wasn't exhausted. Pretend she wasn't breaking apart. She closed her eyes for just a moment, promising herself she would only rest for a second. But as the first light of dawn crept through the window, she was still there, asleep on the floor, arms wrapped around herself for warmth. And in a few hours, she would have to walk into that office as if none of this had ever happened. The blaring sound of the alarm jerked her awake. Her body ached. Every muscle in her back protested as she peeled herself off the hard floor. The apartment was still dim, but she could hear her mother's soft breathing. She was still asleep. Safe. That was all that mattered. Ignoring the hunger gnawing at her stomach, she splashed cold water on her face, forcing herself to look presentable. The mirror reflected the truth she tried to hide: dark circles under her eyes, sunken cheeks, tired skin. But there was no time to care. She slipped into her only clean blouse and left the apartment, heading straight to work. The office was already buzzing when she walked in. People chatted, laughed, sipped coffee. Like they had no worries. Like life wasn't crushing them. She hurried to her desk, hoping to go unnoticed. No such luck. "Oh look, she actually showed up on time today," someone snickered. She ignored it. She had learned a long time ago that fighting back only made things worse. The manager appeared a few moments later, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto her. Her stomach twisted. "You," he called out, voice sharp. "My office. Now." Whispers rippled through the room as she forced her legs to move. The moment she stepped inside, he slammed a folder down on his desk. "This is unacceptable." His voice dripped with frustration. "Your reports are sloppy. Your productivity is low. You're constantly tired. Do you even care about this job?" Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her blouse. Care? She cared enough to push through exhaustion every single day. She cared enough to work herself into the ground just to keep her mother alive. She cared enough to never ask for help, even when she was drowning. But none of that mattered here. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? "I should fire you," the manager continued, shaking his head. "But I'm feeling generous today." Her pulse pounded in her ears. "I need someone to stay late tonight. Finish the reports. Make up for your mistakes." He smirked. "Consider this your chance to prove yourself." She felt her throat tighten. Stay late? Again? Her mother needed her. She thought about the medicine, the hospital visits, the bills she hadn't paid yet. If she lost this job, there would be no more medicine. No more food. No more home. She swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll stay." The manager smirked. "Good." As she left the office, her heart felt heavier than ever. No one knew the price she was paying. No one knew what it was costing her. And no one cared. The office grew quieter as the hours passed. Most of her colleagues had already left, their laughter still echoing in her mind. She sat alone at her desk, her fingers aching as she typed, eyes struggling to stay open. The reports had to be perfect, there was no room for mistakes. But no matter how hard she worked, she knew it wouldn't be enough. The judgment wouldn't stop. The whispers wouldn't end. Her stomach rumbled. She pressed a hand over it, trying to ignore the hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. The numbers on the screen blurred. Her head throbbed. She needed sleep. But she needed this job more. She forced herself to focus, her hands moving automatically over the keyboard. Just a little longer. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. Footsteps. Her breath hitched. She wasn't alone. She turned slightly, expecting the janitor or maybe a security guard. But instead, she saw someone standing near the doorway, a man in a suit, watching her. He had been there for a while. Her hands went still. Who was he? She had never seen him before, but something about him felt different. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're still working?" She nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Just finishing up. He glanced at her screen, then back at her. His expression unreadable. How long have you been here? He asked. She hesitated. What was she supposed to say? Since morning, she admitted, keeping her voice steady. His brow furrowed. And before that? Her fingers tensed on the keyboard. Why was he asking? She swallowed hard. I worked late yesterday, too. He studied her. His eyes flickered to the empty office, to the dark circles under her eyes, to the way she sat hunched over, exhausted, starving, broken. He was seeing her. Really seeing her. But why? She had spent years being invisible. Why now? After a long pause, he finally spoke. Go home. She blinked. Sir, I said go home. His voice was firm. You're exhausted. She opened her mouth to protest, but something about the way he spoke made her stop. She hesitated, then slowly shut down her computer. For the first time, someone had noticed her struggle. But she still didn't understand why. As she grabbed her bag and walked past him, she felt his gaze on her. And something told her that this wasn't the last time they would speak. The morning came too quickly. She had barely closed her eyes before the alarm dragged her back to reality. There was no time to rest. Her mother was still asleep, her breathing steady. The fever had gone down slightly, but she wasn't out of danger yet. With a deep breath, she forced herself up, got dressed in the same worn-out clothes, and headed to work. She had no idea what today would bring. The office felt different the moment she stepped in. People whispered, throwing quick glances in her direction. Her hands tightened around her bag. Had she done something wrong? Was she about to be fired? Before she could process the unease in the air, the manager called her name. Office. Now. Her stomach dropped. This was it. She took slow steps toward the glass door, her heart pounding. She couldn't lose this job. As she stepped inside, she froze. Sitting across from the manager was the same man from last night. The one who had told her to go home. His presence sent a wave of confusion through her. Why was he here? Before she could ask, the manager cleared his throat nervously. This is Mr. Dawson, he said stiffly. He's the CEO of this company. CEO? Her breath caught in her throat. The CEO? The man who had seen her exhaustion last night wasn't just a random executive, he owned everything. The manager shifted uncomfortably, as if the power in the room had shifted. Mr. Dawson's eyes met hers. There was no judgment in them. No mockery. Just something else. Something she couldn't name. I looked through your work last night, he said finally. Her fingers tightened around her bag. I saw the reports you finished. The numbers, the accuracy. The details. She held her breath. You're doing the work of 3 people, he continued, his voice firm. And you're doing it better than most of my senior staff. The manager's face paled. She blinked, unable to process his words. Had she heard that right? Before she could respond, Mr. Dawson leaned forward slightly. I want to know something, he said. Why are you struggling like this? Why are you working yourself to exhaustion? Her mouth went dry. No one had ever asked that before. She could lie. She could say she was just dedicated. That she was trying her best. But for some reason, she couldn't bring herself to do it. My mother, she said quietly. She's sick. I take care of her. Medical bills are expensive. Silence. Mr. Dawson didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked like he had expected that answer. The manager, however, looked uncomfortable. Mr. Dawson finally spoke. "I want to make you an offer." She stiffened. "What kind of offer?" He folded his hands together. "A promotion." Her heart stopped. "A higher position. Better pay. Better hours." She couldn't breathe. Was this real? The manager flinched. "Sir, I don't think." Mr. Dawson silenced him with a look. "I think we've all misjudged her," he said. "And I don't tolerate poor judgment in my company." Her throat tightened. This couldn't be real. A week ago, she had been humiliated in front of everyone. She had been seen as worthless. And now, the CEO himself was offering her a future. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. But before she could speak, Mr. Dawson said one more thing. "However," he said, "before you accept, I need you to know something." She swallowed. "What?" His next words shocked her to the core. She held her breath, waiting for Mr. Dawson's next words. The CEO leaned back slightly, watching her carefully. Then, he said something that sent a chill down her spine. "I've been watching you for longer than you think." Her pulse skipped. "I don't mean that in a bad way," he continued, sensing her alarm. "I mean, I've noticed you. I've seen how hard you work. How much effort you put in. How everyone here underestimates you." Her fingers tightened around her bag. He had noticed. All this time. She had spent years thinking she was invisible. Suffering in silence, enduring humiliation, never being seen. But now, the most powerful man in the company was saying he had been watching, listening, knowing. "I've seen how you take the worst shifts," he said. "How you never complain, even when you're treated unfairly. I wanted to understand why. So, I did something most people wouldn't." He hesitated before continuing. "I had someone follow you home." Her heart stopped. For a moment, she couldn't move. Couldn't speak. She wasn't sure if she should feel grateful or terrified. Seeing the look on her face, he quickly added, "Not for any bad reason. I needed to know if my instincts were right about you." She didn't know what to say. Then, his next words shattered her completely. "I know about your mother." A sharp breath escaped her lips. "I know she's sick. I know you're taking care of her alone. I know you work yourself to exhaustion because you have no choice." Her chest felt tight. She had spent so long hiding it, protecting it, keeping it away from the eyes of judgment. And now, it was out in the open. She gritted her teeth. "Why are you telling me this?" His eyes softened. "Because I believe people like you deserve better." She blinked hard. For so long, she had lived in a world where hard work meant nothing, where people mocked, judged, and ignored her struggles. But now, someone powerful was saying something different. "I'm not offering you this promotion out of pity," he said. "I'm offering it because you've earned it. You've proven that you have more drive, more resilience, and more discipline than anyone here." Her hands shook. A promotion? Better pay? A way out of this life? Her mother wouldn't have to suffer anymore. She wouldn't have to starve anymore. But before she could respond, Mr. Dawson spoke again. "There's one condition." She stiffened. "What is it?" His eyes locked onto hers. "If you take this position, I don't want you working yourself into the ground anymore." She swallowed. "I don't want you skipping meals. I don't want you sleeping on the floor. I don't want you sacrificing yourself anymore." His voice was gentle but firm. "You have the ability to build a better future. But only if you start believing that you deserve one." She felt the first tear slip down her cheek. No one had ever said that to her before. Not once. For years, she had carried this burden alone. And now, someone was offering to lift it, just a little. She wiped her face quickly, taking a shaky breath. "And if I say yes?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A small smile tugged at the corner of Mr. Dawson's lips. "Then your life is about to change forever." She sat there, heart pounding, staring at the man who had just offered her a way out. For years, she had survived by expecting nothing from the world. She had learned that hard work didn't always mean recognition. That pain didn't always lead to relief. That sacrifice didn't always bring rewards. But now, for the first time in her life, someone had seen her. Not her struggles. Not her suffering. Not her mistakes. Her strength. She swallowed hard. I don't know what to say." Mr. Dawson leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Say yes." A million thoughts rushed through her mind. Would she really be able to handle this? Could she step into a better life without feeling like an imposter? And most importantly, did she deserve this? She thought of her mother. All the nights spent by her bedside. All the meals she skipped just to afford medicine. All the time she kept quiet at work, knowing she had no choice but to endure. Maybe she had spent so long surviving that she had forgotten what it meant to actually live. Her fingers tightened into fists. No more. She looked up, determination settling in her chest. "I accept." Mr. Dawson's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. "Good," he said simply. "Then let's get to work." 1 month later. The office felt different now. She still worked hard, but she wasn't struggling anymore. She had moved to a new department where her skills were appreciated. Her paycheck was bigger. Her work was valued. But most importantly, her mother was getting the care she needed. She didn't have to choose between food and medicine anymore. She didn't have to cry herself to sleep, wondering if she would lose everything. She didn't have to hide her struggles. One evening, as she left the office, she passed by the same colleagues who had once laughed at her. They weren't laughing anymore. They watched her with a mix of confusion, regret, and even a little admiration. They had judged her before knowing the truth. And now, they had to live with that. But she didn't care. She had nothing to prove to them anymore. She had already won. As she stepped into the fresh evening air, she thought back to everything she had endured. The pain. The loneliness. The impossible sacrifices. And the one lesson she would never forget. People will always judge what they don't understand. But the real strength lies in never letting it break you. With her head held high, she walked forward, knowing that this time, she wasn't just surviving. She was living.